Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 7 about the judicial branch. It's Lesson 1, where we learn about the common law. In this lesson, you'll learn about the English judicial heritage that was inherited by the United States of America. You'll learn about the common law. You'll learn about the idea of precedent, also known as stare decisis, and you'll learn about judges distinguishing cases. In previous units, we've learned about the legislative branch, which is created by Article 1 of the Constitution. We've learned about the executive branch, which is created by Article 2 of the Constitution. And in this lesson, we'll begin to learn about the judicial branch, which is created by Article 3 of the Constitution. But we really can't begin learning about the judicial branch simply by going to the Constitution, because there's a deep heritage from the government of England which influenced the courts in the United States of America. So to understand the courts here in the United States of America, we really need to kind of go back in time to how courts operated in England back in the Middle Ages, sometimes known as medieval times. We're talking about a period around 1,000 years ago. In Europe, back hundreds of years ago, maybe as much as 1,000 years ago, courts were established to settle disputes between people. Here's an example of one of these ancient courtrooms. Now I want you to notice some things about it. First of all, in the distance, you can see that stone structure that looks like a bench. In fact, it's called a bench. That's where the judge would sit while hearing cases. Now, if you look at the foreground of the picture, there's a wooden bar across, known as the bar. This separated the audience of the trials from the judge who was conducting a trial. We still use these terms in America today. We describe the place where a judge presides from, even though it's a big desk now, as a bench. And we describe the areas that lawyers enter in their careers as the bar. So for example, lawyers who go to law school and then take the exam after law school that allows them to practice law, we call it a bar exam. And we then say, when they enter the field, that they have entered the bar. The point of showing you this terminology isn't that you necessarily have to remember these terms. It's just to show you how the conduct of law in ancient times has been handed down in the very words that we use to talk about law in the United States of America today. But it's influenced our American legal system in far more than just the terms we use. It fundamentally dictates the very structure and practice of law in the United States of America. In this lesson and in the lessons that follow, we're going to talk about 5 areas in which this ancient history has influenced the way courts are operating in the United States of America. The first of these areas that we're going to talk about is something called the common law. The easiest definition of the common law is to say that it is judge-made law. Now, when I say that it's judge-made law, based on some other things you've already learned in this course, that should immediately cause you to say, hey, wait a minute, does that make sense? And the reason it should make you wonder is because in previous lessons you've been taught that it's the legislature that legislates, in other words, that makes laws. And then it's the executive that executes, in other words, carries out the laws. And it's the judiciary that then judges whether or not people have obeyed those laws that were made by the legislature. So in this basic separation of powers organization, the judiciary is not making laws. It is simply judging whether or not people have kept the laws that have been made by the legislative branch. So how can we be talking about judge-made law when we're talking about the common law? Well, what about areas where no legislation has been passed? what is to be done in those situations. In other words, if someone came to court with some sort of a dispute and there was no law to cover their situation, no law created by the legislature, what is a judge to then do? Well, in much of the world where they have what they call statutory law systems, or also called codified law systems or civil law systems, the answer from the judge would be, I'm sorry, there's nothing to cover your case, so we can't do anything about it. But that's not how the law evolved in England. In England, judges took it upon themselves to render decisions, even in those cases where there was not a law. Now, one judge rendering one decision in one case does not create law for everyone. All it does is solve the issue for those people before him. But in the judge doing that, he has effectively filled in a hole in the law. There's no law that's been passed by the legislature to cover that area, so the judge just kind of makes something up. Now, the judge is filling in holes in the law in that way ends up having profound implications for how the law develops, which I'll explain in just a moment. But I want you to realize that this idea of judges filling the law in is a fairly rare thing in the world. It's only generally done in common law countries. Common law countries are countries that were part of the British Empire at one point. Now, you look at this map of the world, there's only a handful of countries that still practice the common law, at least in some sense the way England did. There are a few other countries, states that use a mixed system where they have elements of the common law but don't entirely make use of it. But you notice most of the rest of the world doesn't use these systems. Most of the world is based on statutory or Islamic law or some other religious law. The common law is only in places that were at one point under the power of England. So to understand how our common law system works, we really have to trace it back to the judges in England hundreds of years ago. And these judges were itinerant judges. Now, what is meant by that is that they would move around rendering decisions. They would travel from village to village, hearing individual cases and dispensing justice to the people that had issues. So, to really explain how this developed into a system of law, I'm going to use a series of sort of frankly silly examples. Now, these examples, please don't misunderstand and think that they are based on real common law cases. They're not. They're just a way to illustrate the principle of what happened when these judges traveled around and rendered decisions that produced what we now call the common law. So let me begin and imagine a judge traveling into a village, and he finds that there's two neighbors there that are having a dispute. They live next to each other, they keep their livestock around each other, and one of them comes in to complain to the judge when he arrives in town. And what that neighbor says is that his neighbor stole his goat. Well, now, you may think that even if he can bring in witnesses and they have testimony and say that's true, that probably the easiest solution is to just make the neighbor give the goat back. But to eliminate that from our hypothetical example here, we'll say that the neighbor then ate the goat. He stole the goat, he ate the goat. So now the goat doesn't exist anymore to be given back. But the guy who had the goat stolen walks into the courtroom and tells the judge, I want justice. I demand that you correct this situation. I've got witnesses here, whatever it is. I can prove that this happened. Now I want you to give a decision that will set it right. So the judge thinks about it and he says, well, your neighbor stole your goat, so I'm going to make him give you one of his goats back in return. But then the judge goes on to say that isn't good enough by itself. You see, if you only make somebody give a goat back when they've stolen a goat, they really have no incentive to stop stealing goats. So the judge wants to kind of punish the neighbor a little bit too for stealing a goat, and he did. So he says, the neighbor has to give you in return a goat and 2 chickens. Slams his gavel down, the case is over, the sheriff's sent off to collect the goat and 2 chickens, and justice is done. Now, what would happen under the common law system is the judge that's out there traveling that renders that decision At the end of his route around through the villages, he would go back to London and he would report the decisions that he made to the other judges. They'd be written down in books that they could all study to see what each other was doing. So now let's imagine a few years later, there's another judge that comes into a different village. And in that different village, someone comes in and brings a case and says, I've got an issue. My neighbor stole my goat. Same basic situation. And he says, furthermore, after my neighbor stole my goat, my neighbor ate my goat. So this different judge in a different town is hearing essentially the same sort of case. And the man who's brought the case is demanding justice. Now, what is justice in this new case? What should this new judge do to set this new situation correct? Well, the new judge says, hey, you know what? There was a case just like this a few years ago. I read it in one of our common law books back in London, or I heard the judge tell me about it who rendered the decision in this previous case. And when he was faced with a case just like this, what he decided was you had to provide a goat and 2 chickens in return for the goat that was stolen and eaten. So he then orders that to happen. That is the solution to the case based on the rule from the previous case. So now notice what's happened here. Original judge was faced with a unique situation. He rendered a decision, and then a later judge looked back at what he did and decided to do the same thing. From this, we get the idea that we call precedent. Precedent is when a prior decision is used to guide future decisions in similar situations. Precedent used in court is sometimes called stare decisis. For reasons that you'll learn about later in this unit, judges love to use Latin phrases that the rest of us don't understand. Stare decisis literally means let the decision stand. But the point is, what stare decisis means is this rule of precedent, that what previous judges have done in similar situations, later judges will do also. Now think about what this does, is if once a decision is made, other judges follow it in later cases, even though that rule isn't written down in any law passed by the legislature, in effect it becomes a rule followed by judges. It is just like law without being written down as law. This then is where we get the notion of the common law, which consists of the traditions and precedents that have been created that then judges follow. They're not laws actually passed by the legislature. They are sort of rules that have been created by the judges themselves that they follow. But because they all follow them, it's as though there was a law written down. And where do you go find these rules? You go to the books where the judges have written down their decisions. But do the judges always follow these precedents? In other words, in every later situation that's similar, will they keep doing the same thing? Let's go back to our sort of silly example about the stolen goat. Let's imagine there's another judge later in another village. He shows up and there's a guy that comes in to complain who says, my neighbor stole my goat. And he says, furthermore, my neighbor ate my goat. Well, this later judge will say, oh, this is an easy case. When the man starts screaming, I want justice, the judge knows just exactly what to do based on these precedents that we've already talked about. He says, hey, you know what, there was a case just like this. And in that previous case, matter of fact, now a series of cases, when your neighbor steals your goat and eats it, you're going to get a goat and 2 chickens in return. But then the man that had his goat stolen says, wait, no. Well, why wait? Because the goat in this situation is different. Maybe the guy says, yeah, in those previous cases, the goat that was stolen, that then there was a goat and 2 chickens given in return, was just an average, everyday, run-of-the-mill, normal goat. But my goat that was stolen was a prize-winning mama goat. It gave record amounts of milk that we made into cheese and sold to support the family. It had beautiful new kids every year, which gave me a whole flock of goats that I could sell. This goat was essential to supporting our family, and my neighbor ate it. And maybe the judge listens to that and says, you know what? You're right. That goat was different. And because that goat was different, I'm not going to follow that old rule of requiring your neighbor to give you a goat and 2 chickens in return. Instead, I'm going to require your neighbor to give you 2 goats in return. So notice what this judge did. He said, this situation is different, so I did get to create a new rule. Now let's imagine yet another circumstance. Some other judge, off in some other village, confronted by a similar situation. Somebody says, my neighbor stole my goat. They say my neighbor ate my goat. They say, I want justice. The judge says there is a case just like this previously. Matter of fact, a series of cases. And in those series of cases, if your neighbor steals your goat and eats it, and your goat is an average goat, you get a goat and 2 chickens in return. Or if your goat is an exceptionally good goat, maybe you get 2 goats in return. But then the person who's being accused of the crime here says, wait, no, I don't think either of those rules should apply. Why? Because this goat was different. It wasn't a prize-winning mama goat. It wasn't an average everyday goat. It was an old scrawny goat that was about to die anyway. It was worthless. Yeah, maybe I stole it and ate it, but no way it was worth any of that. And maybe the judge agrees and says, you know what, you're right, that goat was different, so these previous cases don't really fit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make you only give 2 chickens in return for that goat that you stole. Well, what we see from these examples is what we call distinguishing cases. Distinguishing cases is where a judge says, wait a minute, the situation before me is different. Therefore, the common law rules that have been created in previous cases don't apply. Therefore, I get to make up my own new rule. Okay, so now let's review what we learned in this case, in this lesson. What is the common law? Is it laws passed by Congress, laws for average citizens, executive orders, or judge-made laws? The common law is judge-made law. It's where judges make up rules that then are followed by later judges, where they effectively become like law without having ever been passed by a legislature. What is a precedent? Is it a chief executive? Is it a previous decision that needs to be followed? Is it some sort of innovative decision? Or is it a case that is undecided? A precedent is a previous decision that needs to be followed by later judges, or at least can possibly be followed by later judges. What happens when a case is distinguished? Is it that the precedent doesn't apply? Is it that the common law doesn't apply at all? Is it that it's a very important case? Or is it something that must follow a previous case or cases? When a case is distinguished from others, essentially what judges are saying is the precedent doesn't apply here. Therefore, I as a judge can make up a new rule, which is a wonderfully empowering thing for judges. No wonder they love the common law, which they do, because it allows them to make up rules. Now, what I didn't say in the lesson, but I'll point out now, is that it goes even farther than that. Imagine that judges don't even want to enforce a legislative law, something passed by the legislature. They're going to basically apply this common law technique to that and say, well, you know what? That law that was passed by the legislature about stealing goats and how much you get in return and that kind of stuff, that was about average goats. And in the case before me, it's not an average goat. Therefore, I get to make up a new rule. This common law tradition allows judges to make up all kinds of stuff without necessarily even worrying about what the legislature says. And this tradition was inherited by judges in the United States of America, which is one of the reasons why the courts are so powerful in America, as eventually you'll see as we continue through this lesson. Okay, so that finishes the first lesson from Unit 7. Our next lesson from Unit 7, Lesson 2, will be about the idea of trial by jury.